this is my privilege to moderate this keynote speech session, but at the same time, somehow I hate this kind of moderation. Particularly when I introduce someone like Rachel Coopers. She has a long list of achievements. It's quite annoying to really to list up all the introduction and all together, you know. But anyway, I'll try, okay. She is currently Distinguished Professor of Design Management and Policy at Lancaster University. She is the founding director of Imagination Lancaster, one of the most active open design lab, design center. And also, most importantly, she is affiliated to School of Design Hong Kong Polytechnic University as an advisory board member. Isn't that good? It's wonderful, okay? And also she is president of the Design Research Society, DRS, and her research interests include design thinking, design management, design policy, design for well-being and society, responsible design, okay? And also she is founding editor of Design Journal and serving a lot of editorship in many numerous journals. And she also did many mega-scale research projects, including something like the research project including livable cities, a £5 million project for 6 years. Okay, so she had that kind of big project, the leader. Personally, I worked with her at research assessment exercise panel member for Aalto University many years ago. So since then, you know, I exchanged with her and together and so on, so on. And today, I think that the speech will be excellent. Please prepare many challenging questions. Okay, okay, Rachel. All right, woman in red. Okay, okay.
Okay.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning. Good afternoon, and hello. Thank you very much. That makes me very, very nervous. That introduction, Kun-Pyo. That is. I'm sure I'm not all those things, but it's very nice of you to say such kind words about me and to have me to speak to you today. I wanted to share my screen for a start, but I wanted also to thank you for inviting me, but also to thank the technical people in the background who have been working very hard to make this work properly and clearly and efficiently, and they've done a fantastic job. So right from the beginning, I want to thank them too. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I have about 50 minutes. 50 minutes is a long time to listen to me. I hope to goodness that you can keep your attention. I can keep your attention for all that time. When I was thinking about this presentation, I was going to just talk about some recent research. And then I thought, because I was asked to think about design thinking, and I thought I've been thinking about design thinking for a long time. I want to think about how we need to think differently and design more radically over the coming years. But I also wanted to reflect on the word value. We have always promoted the value of design. I have in my whole career promoted the value of design. Companies are told, you know, that design gives them value, but I also wanted to reflect on what we think about values. So I'm going to take time to think about designing differently, thinking differently, designing radically, designing value, and looking at design values in the context of the world today. Now, if I can actually move my slides on, that would help. Yeah. So the first thing I started to think about was does design lead or follow the mood of the times? Are we leading thinking, or are we just following the money, or following the mood of the times? Has design done more harm than good? We always talk about the good, the value of design doing good, but actually, if we look at the world today, there may be ways in which design has done quite a lot of harm. So these are things I started to reflect on. Now, my talk will be in 3 parts, so you can sort of know where you are. The first will be a short reflection on where design's been, the role of design. Then I will reflect on the current and briefly reflect on the current and future challenges. And then I will use research projects, examples to show how we in Lancaster and in Imagination are trying to think differently, design radically, and discuss how we have to do that even more going forward. So first of all, I want to set my talk in a context. I've been a professor for 21, 25 years, I can't even remember. I've been teaching for over 40 years, and I've been doing research over that time. And as Jonathan Wooden says here, the history of design has matured over that time. However, it's been geographically dominated by a focus on a small number of countries in the industrial world. And I have to say that in my academic career, I've been working alongside colleagues in the UK, but also in Europe, North America, Southeast Asia, and Australia and New Zealand. But let's say that is either the global north or in developed countries. I want to state at the beginning that that's been my experience, and has tended to inform my worldview. And now I would tell students studying design to think entirely differently, to think about the whole world. So just to note, this is a sort of side note about how our work has developed and how we need to not suddenly, but carefully think differently about design and design research for the whole world. That's number one. But let's go back to where design came from a UK perspective. In fact, the Design and Industries Association was formed in 1915 by British industrialists who decided that they wanted to raise the standard of British industrial design, the purpose of which was to build and boost the economy through improved competitiveness and to be able to sell products abroad. They started with the slogan, "Nothing needs be ugly." So they obviously believed that traditional engineering produced ugly things and they needed designers to actually make them less ugly. Let's move quickly forward to the Design Council, which came into being in 1944. And again, this was to drive the economy in Britain. Remember, it was just before the end of the war. We needed to improve both the production of our products, but also the overall design and reception of our products. So in that sense, in the first half of the 20th century, design was being promoted as a way in which we could improve our economy and our industrial competitiveness and help companies sell both to UK and globally. However, and that continued, I would say, throughout the 20th century. However, in the 1960s, we did start to get some alternative thinking. Not to say there wasn't any before, but the 60s was an era of protest, of alternative perspectives, of new movements. And we saw the Green Revolution, we saw the feminist movement, we saw the anti-war protests in Vietnam, the anti-nuclear protests. So we saw in the 60s a sort of formation of protest, of alternative perspectives, which from which emerged, you know, the sort of topics of eco-design, sustainable design, inclusive, universal design. The seeds of those topics started to arrive in the 1960s. And in fact, we also saw alongside that, companies were starting to think of corporate social responsibility, what their responsibility was to society, to the world, beyond their own competitiveness, their own growth in profits, etc. Now, a number of cynics would say that this was a response to the anti-capitalist movements, that it just increased cause marketing for a cause. And we would like to think, well, what was design's contribution here? What were designers doing in response to companies wanting to sort of greenwash themselves, talk about corporate social responsibility without necessarily being sincere about that? So again, it was worthwhile questioning where design was and whether design continued its path to deliver to the economic forces that was around it. And actually, we can see that in the 70s, 80s and 90s, particularly in the UK, but around the world, we had a drive for growth, a drive for commercial profit, for internationalization, this drove much of the thinking in the design world. I remember in the 70s and 80s, most of my research was developing case studies to illustrate how design helped companies deliver better products, better communications, better marketing, but it was through design to drive commercial profits. And that's where we began to develop material that illustrated the relationship between design and innovation, design-driven innovation, design and new product development. I remember in the 80s, I did a huge international study with Professor Bill Sauder from the United States, looking at new product development in countries around the world. And I was looking at what was the role of design in new product development around the world. And this was all to do with improving new product development. In also this new topic, which was the topic of design management. So design management again started in the 1960s, but really peaked during the 80s and 90s. We started to see courses in design management, and this was all about promoting design as a servant necessarily of industrial growth of companies, to enable companies to deliver to the marketplace. And this was at a point when we had industrial design, we had more relationships between marketing and design, and the development of the service economy. So in the late 90s, we recognized that it was not just new products, it was not a product-based economy. We in the UK and Europe had a service-based economy. And guess what? The design community developed service design. If we were designing for products, we could now apply our knowledge and our tools to service design. And we started to develop that area as a legitimate research area, as a resilient area, discipline in which to practice. We were embedding the relationships between design and innovation into not only new products, but new services. However, designers did have a conscience. And I think my colleague Andrew Wotton and I developed this model in about 2001, 2002. And this was where we started to compare the drive for corporate social responsibility with what the responsibility of designers. This is where we started to see the role of design in helping companies develop their policies in their legal and responsibility policies, but also how they could become ethically more sound, or how they could develop their values around the environment, the economy, and the social aspects of the world. So we developed this model to illustrate that design could now start to look at different areas of responsibility, which included health, education, social inclusion, crime, environment, fair trade, and economic policy. But we could do it not just for business and commerce, but for other non-governmental bodies, charities, pressure groups. We could do it both for individuals and society. So we started to illustrate that agenda by undertaking projects, which I did in the early 2000s on design against crime. We developed design for sustainability, design for health. So we started to move away from just the single disciplines of product and graphic design and interiors to look at where design could contribute to the economy. The social responsibility model. So we've been doing that for 20 years. We also, and if I can move this slide on, we also had built by that time quite a sort of evidence base of theory and practice focused around user-centered design, appropriating knowledge bases from ethnography and anthropology. So we now have design ethnography, design anthropology. We introduced, because of user-centered design, participatory design, co-design, co-creation, and of course, design thinking. We had all sorts of models and methods to address these issues. Now, around that time in 2004, I gave my first presentation, which tried to switch the way we thought about the application of design for society and for the globe generally. And I gave a presentation in 2004. And this presentation started with the great challenges. Now, I wasn't very sure about what the great challenges were. So I called a colleague and friend, Chris Lubigman, who was the head of Futures for Arup, the large international architecture and construction consultancy. And between us, we came up with 4 great challenges. And these are the challenges. Climate change. This was, remember, back in 2004, before the last 2 COPs at least. And obviously we were aware that climate change was an important factor, and as designers we had to think about it then. We also talked about the demographic drift, the aging population in the West, poverty and migration in other parts of the world, and the rising number of young people in Asia and Africa. We saw these as challenges. Of course, we've been dealing with the elderly population for quite a considerable number of years. We'd had inclusive design, universal design. We have the design the Helen Hamlin Design Centre at the Royal College of Art that's been around for 30 years now. So we have been looking at the aging population in the West. But taken all together, the demographic drift, this change in populations and the movement of population, we knew was going to be a challenge in the early part of the start of this century. And then we took the third one was global cohesion, or the lack thereof. We've just come through the crisis of the Twin Towers. We have seen war. We've seen the fabric of society changing, and this related to safety in products, in places, the desire for people to get into gated communities, to build safe havens, and also the desire for weapons. So again, another challenge, the global cohesion, which is no different today. And finally, we had the movement of stuff and people in an era of rising carbon costs. We were talking about this in the early 2000s. We're still talking about this. What has design done? What is it doing? And have we got to think very differently about the way we undertake research and the way we undertake professional practice and gain our living by design? So that was 2004. In 2006, I was given the opportunity and the funding to move to Lancaster University to create anything I wanted to. It was the best gift I'd ever had. It was, I had £3 million to recruit anybody I wanted to and to build a lab. And I decided to call it Imagination because at that time I felt we needed not to call ourselves a design lab, but to think, to explain to the world we were thinking differently and we were imagining futures. I was also lucky later to get £10 million for a new building. So I recruited 7 people to come and work with me at Lancaster, an interdisciplinary group where we had no boundaries, joining forces with scientists and social scientists to address the challenges that we saw before us. Since 2006, every 7 years, we've developed a purpose statement. I'm not going to bore you with each of the 3 statements we created, but we used just one sheet of paper which illustrated all our values, what we intended to do, what our character was, and where we wanted to go. And this was the only strategy we ever had, the only piece of paper we've ever written. And this was brought together by another colleague who used to be the director, chief executive of Saatchi and Saatchi Global. He helped us spend a day creating our purpose statements. This was the last one, and where we wanted our statement, our vision was transforming the world through design-led research. And we believed in, and I think this is very important that designers state what they believe in, you know, the unstoppable power of imagination, exceptional design shapes the world. So we still believe that design can shape the world, but we have to think about whether it shapes the world in a good or bad way. That deep immersion and engagement leads to revelations. So actually immersing ourselves in a discipline, in a topic, and engagement with other people leads to revelations. We believe in uncharted territory and we revel in uncertain ground. Well, uncertain ground we are certainly in today, and that is a factor. The ability to cope with change is one of the major issues that we have today. It causes mental health problems, it causes instability in governments. So actually training ourselves and our colleagues to revel in uncertain ground is a key factor in going forward today. So we wanted our place to be full of fun and a brilliant place to do design research. Now, moving forward to 2019, we received another £13 million worth of funding from the UK government to double the size of the team. And we decided we weren't going to look for disciplines, we were just going to focus on themes and clusters. And so our clusters, you can see there, home and living, community and the public sector, factory and workplace, city and urban, population and policy. We were going to focus on certain areas in the world too, where we have already existing relationships, and build other relationships through our international theme. We also have a theme of prosperity and evaluation, a theme of sustainability and health. So we realized that none of these clusters are stovepipes. We have to work together. We have to look at the complex interdependencies between living and home and living, and work and factory and workplace, or city and urban. but we have to look at these complex urban dependencies and look at where we can collaborate in terms of modeling and collaborative intelligence. So we're now, I can't think about the number, I think we're now to about 45, 50 people, plus our doctoral students and our researchers. So what I want to do now is talk about how we are using design and imagination to think differently, and to challenge whether we are thinking differently enough. And I'm not saying that we're any different to a lot of what my colleagues around the world are doing. I know that quite a lot of my PhD students and our PhD students work somewhere else. We have alumni and staff who are now working all over the world. And I think we're all thinking differently about design. But I want to draw on the examples from imagination to explain how we can think differently in the future. So I think Kun-Pyo actually discussed the Livable Cities project. And this is where I talk about the role of design in bigger projects. I've always expressed the need for design to move out of its silo, to engage with other disciplines. And this was a chance I had with my colleagues to work with three other universities to look at the city and to undertake case studies in cities with transport engineers, engineering science, energy engineers, water engineers, ecologists, social scientists, architects, urban theorists, planners, and computer scientists. And this was a project, 5 years. Not only did we undertake case studies, we spent a lot of time exchanging knowledge, exchanging understanding of cities and the way in which we look at them through our own particular disciplinary lenses. And that challenged the way in which we looked at them, talking to other people, talking to computer scientists, and how we model cities, how we look at what we mean by low carbon, what we mean by quality of life, what we mean by strategies for energy, water, transport, and how design and design thinking can change the way we look at the world and the way we do research on cities. As a result of our work with this group of scientists and social scientists, we produced a series of publications that introduced to the public the topics and the solutions that we were looking at. So rather than just write academic papers, which of course I have to say some of our younger academics want to do because they want to get the papers, they want to get their careers. And I think it's just important, particularly a value of designers, is to communicate very clearly what we're doing in our research and how other people can think about it. Not just the public, but policymakers. So here you can see our range of little books explaining what a car-free city might look like, what low carbon eating might be, how a city might be built around sharing. So we were not only challenging the architects, the engineers, the computer scientists to think about how they might redesign cities now, but also to explain what implications this might have in the future, and to communicate that in a clear, graphical and simple way in which the policymakers could pick up as well as citizens. So it is, my value is that designers need to communicate their research very easily to the rest of the world. Now, I think you might be able to see behind me, I wrote a book in 2006 with my colleague Naomi Jacobs called Living in Digital Worlds. And actually we are living in digital worlds at the moment, no less on a Zoom call to a conference internationally. And I wrote that book just as I moved onto another very large project with colleagues. So we moved from thinking about the physical world to the digital world and digital living. And I joined a large interdisciplinary project as a core member, bringing the Imagination team along with me to form something called the Petrus National Centre of Excellence for IoT Systems Security. Let me just explain that. So Petrus stands for privacy, ethics, trust, reliability, acceptability, and security. And if you think about it, design has a relationship with every one of those topics. So here we are, Lancaster, with 5 other universities, UCL, Imperial College London, Oxford University, and Warwick University, came together to build a consortium of 22 further research institutes to look at IoT, AI, cybersecurity, and the whole aspect of the future of living in digital worlds. And we now are a very large consortium working with over 120 partners nationally and internationally, looking at the aspects of the digital world in relation to energy, health, finance, media, industry, communication services, and government. And what I want to do now is explain the way in which my colleagues at Lancaster responded to this big program. We've had up to now £20 million over 10 years to work on this project. And we have a lot of projects going on, but I'm just going to talk about the Petrus project that we are doing at Lancaster. And this is where I bring in my wonderful colleagues at Imagination, starting with internet in the home. So Paul Colton and his team worked on exploring adoption and accessibility in the home, and where we have all our homes are now full of speakers and intelligent objects and products. So what Paul was looking at was the adoption accessibility. What he did was actually think beyond human-centered design. So again, thinking differently. We now have these constellation of artifacts, IoT artifacts in our homes, and we need to look at them in a different way. Typically, design is focused on the human part of the user and the thing, the relationship between the user and the thing. And that, in IoT systems and the use of AI and machine learning, hides the rest of the system from the user. And I would come back to say Don Norman, who began a lot of work with, simplicity and ensuring that design makes things simple so users can understand the product or the service. Now, in fact, should we be doing that? Should we think differently? Actually, what we should think about is the human being part of a constellation of IoT things. For instance, here we have an IoT regulator who wants to ensure the devices are secured by default. We have platform providers that want to sell downloadable data as content and profit by it. We have standards bodies who want to make the devices and the infrastructure work together. So when we design for the Internet of Things, it's crucial that we accept every feature and aspect has a different meaning depending on where you stand. And I'm going to take an example. Paul and his colleagues use design fictions to illustrate what we might call object-oriented ontology, where we're developing products from a centerless design approach. And here we have a design of a smart kettle, a fictional design of a smart kettle, I might add, but it reveals on each aspect of it the different intentions of use, so that the user better understands their role in the constellation. So you have fictional organizations, the off IAT, who are the regulators, the designers who are designing something so that you will understand how much it's going to take how much energy it's going to take it to boil it, or how much time it's going to take. We have the sellers, and we also have the interoperability of the whole system. So we start to think about how we can expose the workings behind these digital products in digital systems, in this digital world, and actually illustrate how we design and think beyond the human. Paul took this further, and Paul developed with the BBC the living room of the future. Now, this living room he created and exhibited at the Tate Modern Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum and various other places. And the whole reasoning behind the living room of the future was to dynamically contextualize the media for particular audiences using data generated by the viewers' interactions with the living room. So the bottles of water on the table could be recognized. The various, your iPhone as you went into the living could be recognized. And there was a relationship between the media and the viewer, so that it expanded the viewing experience out of the screen into the physical connected objects within the living room, to make the living room an immersive media experience, so that when something happened in the television, the lights in the room changed, or the sound changed, or something else happened. So this was a fictional experience to expose the attributes of the space. And so the living room future highlights that relationship between object-based media, the media objects, the data objects, the physical objects. They were all that data went into something called a data box, which was at the heart of the system. And the reason that data box is the heart of the system was that's where all the data came together. And importantly, that is so that the viewer, the user, could see the flows of data, and the algorithms were what being used, so that at the end of their experience in the living room of the future, they were provided with a physical till tape, a receipt of all the data that had left them and they had communicated within the system. And this was to expose them to the risks as well as the opportunities of these rich systems, immersive systems that we could be living in the future. It created a fully situated experience. So unlike traditional prototypes, technology prototypes, this enabled us to understand the fully situated experience that blends both real and fictional elements in a room. So we were blending real and fictional aspects of the world together, and made the room feel mundanely familiar, but also new and futuristic. And that's an important point. It's how we start to become very familiar and almost accept the technologies that are around us, that are adapting to us, but we are adapting to it. And again, I would ask, what is the role of the designer here? Is it to facilitate this? Is it to hide all that? Or is it to expose it? Taking this further, we need to think about more than human futures when we do research. So Paul and his colleagues were thinking beyond the much hyped futures cone, and thinking about and contesting basically the universal notions of the present. So we have a particular view of the present, we have a particular view of the past. I set mine out at the beginning of this presentation, and that will inform how we think about the future. We, as designers, must first start to think of the different lived experience of individuals, communities around the world. We also should think about the plurality of different perspectives in the past, the present, and the future within our design processes. So we have an even more complex challenge when we're designing. We're thinking about beyond human systems, we're thinking about human systems, and we're thinking about the digital systems that behind the objects and the products and the services we are creating for the future. So, a lovely new topic to consider, and something developed by Paul and his colleagues, speculative ontography. In this, they and I remember, I'm just listening to them and I'm explaining theirs. So I'm sure they could say it much better than me. I'm sure Paul is much more eloquent on this than me, but it is really fascinating to think about this. How do we speculate about the future? So speculative ontography is used to map that relationship between the human and the non-human actants and highlight the interdependency within those relationships. So start to map out the future by looking at the maps of those systems. And Paul gave us an example, or gave me an example, whereby he was looking at the Consumer Electronics Show in 2019, where Continental, the company Continental, worked with Antibiotics to present a vision of the last meter robotic package delivery by combining autonomous legged robots with self-driving shuttles. Now, that is all about a new novel way of delivering packages. Actually, Paul used this as a way in which to think about all the other factors and the relationships between those actants in that system, to actually start to challenge the environmental impact, the energy use, the consumption of natural resources, the logistics, and to reveal answers to the questions that might say, well, what does the system collect? How is it used, and who can access that data? So both the impact on the earth and the impact on people and the impact on society. So again, we have to think differently and look at how we examine the world from a design perspective. Paul takes this further by creating the future mundane. So he then has started to build a caravan, well, actually it exists now, a caravan where he explores the creation of experiential mundane AI housed in a caravan so that it can be evaluated by the general public, so that we can address these issues that we're talking about and map the constellations and the universe that is the digital and physical world. Taking this further, my colleague Naomi Jacobs in the Petrus project uses design thinking, design futures to explore privacy in the city and how we can ethically deploy the Internet of Things sensors and systems. So in this case, she's using Lancaster and helping Lancaster City Council by developing some fictional products in the city, using field guides and walking around the city with policymakers and the community to start to understand the way in which IoT is being used and can be used in the city and how we need to deploy it ethically. Furthermore, colleagues Dr. Michael Stead and Dr. Adrian Guadinar are looking at the edge of tomorrow with the BBC. What they want to do is look at how smart data with billions of devices, with small voice assistants and fitness trackers, are producing a tsunami of data. That data is being sent to the cloud. When it's sent to the cloud, it exudes large volumes of harmful carbon emissions. So we should keep it at the edge. We should keep it at the edge. We should keep it in the devices. However, if we keep it in the devices, it becomes more vulnerable to cyber attacks. So how do we use design fiction, design thinking to engage in these challenges of sustainability and data security? What Michael and Adrian have done is develop a speculative design terminal, called Prometheus terminal, where we engage with the public to start to play games, arcade games, to raise the awareness not only of environmental costs of cyber attacks, but the datafication of edge of IoT and the security risks. The team will then use that to help the BBC improve the public's adoption of their smart devices and services, and to think about that going forward. So we need to think differently about the digital. We need to think differently now about sustainability. Lisa Thomas, who another colleague of mine, is thinking about that from the perspective of the actual devices themselves, and looking at how we can use participatory design to create more meaningful, purposeful digital objects and products. Challenging the modern values and the critical forms, and looking at producing alternative thinking and alternative digital products. What should they be? What are the values and the relationship we have with the materials? And what are the aesthetics for developing products in a future world? I'm going to move fast now. So another Michael Stead is also working on a project called the Repair Shop 2049, looking at how we can think about repairing digital products of the future, looking at current IoT devices and how likely they are to end up in landfills, and how we can design them in a way that reduce that electronic waste. Not something that we haven't been doing, that designers haven't been doing, but we need to take that a step forward. We need to look at the IoT devices and how we might repair them, not from just a physical point of view, but a digital point of view. There are so many devices now in the system that are actually defunct because the companies that produce the software have closed down, the software isn't upgraded, they're not purposeful, they're not secure. So there's a huge area we have to rethink differently about the way in which we use products going forward and make them all more sustainable. Taking that a little bit further, we need to think differently about materials. Dr. Adam Blaney is working on pushing the thinking about materials. He is radically rethinking the way we structure materials, the fabrication mechanisms, the material platforms, the digital design. He's looking at making our objects and structures that can be updated, adapted, and self-healed over time. He's trying to create circular materials that radically reduce waste. I'm not going to take this video. Here's a video of some work he's doing to investigate the relationship between design and fabrication. Here, heat melts magnetized wax and positions magnets, and the position of the magnets in the wax create multiple material properties that can be updated on demand. Amazing. I don't even actually, I have to get him to explain this all the time. But again, this is challenging the way we think about materials going forward. And I'm just trying to move on. And so his final figure here, which I can't explain too much because it's so technical, but I have to engage with it as a designer, as a design thinker, to ensure that we collaborate across the research team. But these final images are how structures and material properties can be iteratively updated. Moving on very quickly now, my colleague Nick Dunn is thinking differently about cities. He has recently written a book called Dark Matters, which questions the long-held negative view, particularly in the West, that cities are a bad place to be in the evening, in the night. They're perceived as insecure and dangerous and not a place to be. His book counteracts that. He's been using autoethnography, spatial practices, and critical theory to change the way we view cities, to contribute to the debate of how we might design cities in the future. In fact, he's been given some money out of our funds to build a dark lab at Lancaster. So he's now bringing the whole issue of beyond human thinking, looking at how we engage non-human thinking, how we might think about the identity of urban places after dark, how we might think about designing places with a better understanding of the non-human landscapes and the invisibility of urban natures at night. He wants to look at how we might design places for nocturnal species. So, thinking differently about innovation. Colleagues have been thinking about the relationship between design and innovation and taking it further, providing a way of infrastructuring for innovation. So working with the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, we've been helping them to grow innovative practices and behaviours already present in the teams. We've been developing models and approaches with them and skeletons of building blocks that they can use as a language for experimentation and risk-taking. And so much so that when COVID hit and the learning team at the V&A then had the tools they needed to radically change the way in which they worked without the design interventions, without designers there, they actually were able to radically change what they offered at the V&A during COVID. Whereas my colleague Leon Cruikshank is looking more deeply at co-designing. Again, changing our thinking. Co-designing has often been designing interactions with a few people, with a small community, with a small group. Now he's looking at co-designing of tools that allow everyone to co-design, taking the designer out of the process. And during COVID, he developed, rather than where other parts of the university gave people computers with no training, gave disadvantaged communities computers and other technologies, we looked at giving them a box with prompts in to stimulate children's discovering imagination. What this has done, this has actually enabled the schools to rethink how they, what has changed in the children during COVID, how these sort of tools have enabled their imagination, enabled them to continue to learn and discover. So, finally, or not quite finally, but nearly, we've also been thinking differently about design research itself. My colleague Joe Linley has been given 5 years worth of funding to look at design research itself, to think differently about design research. And with his colleague David Green, through something called Design Research Works, they've been testing the boundaries of exploratory workshops, challenging Zoom calls, challenging formats like Miro, and developing projects that look differently at research workshops. Also pushing the boundaries of publishing and conferencing. So he produced a paper called This Is Not a Paper, published in the CHI 2120 conference, really thinking what a research paper should be in a conference, how we should navigate it, that it shouldn't be delivered in a linear fashion, and using tools like GatherTown to change the way in which we publish research. And again, using documentary to look at the way in which we interact and we ask fundamentals about design research. And that's an ongoing project. And finally, we should start to look at the fundamentals of design research and what it means to be human. And that's what my colleague, Professor Stuart Walker, has been doing. In fact, since he joined me in 2006 to form Imagination, to start to think about then what it means to be human. His latest book, Thinking Differently, challenges the notion of modernity and encourages us to think differently about design, to look at our past, to look at the intuitive, the subjective, the compassionate, the mythical, and the symbolic, to bring this back into design, to create a new philosophy of material cultures, that one is more rounded, more balanced, with a greater accord with planet and people. And this brings us back to my beginning. We need to think more differently about our position in political and economic agency. Briefly, my colleague, Justin Sachs, is looking at commonized design. Now, commonized design was developed by, the 8 principles of commonized design was developed by an economist, Elinor Ostrom, when she talked about governing the commons. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And the commons is a shared resource. We might know the Wikipedia as a commons. It means a place which is under the governance of people, instead of under the governance of a state or a market. It's a shared resource, and it is both politically and economically managed by that community. So what Justin is doing is looking at how we can apply that principle to design. Can we have commonized design? It provides a way to define problems and develop solutions that address how communities gain both economic and political agency over the resources they have to hand. So in this case, we're talking about an open ventilator system where the design files were open, the parts could be produced and assembled locally, and everything was owned by the commons. In fact, the UK government now have a fund called Community Ownership Fund, which is to help communities take ownership of assets which they perceive as risk or are important to the community. So I think we need to think differently about our approach to design, and commonized design is one answer. And finally, we need to think differently about what we value. Design has been an agent of the economists. And if we look at what we've been doing over the 20th century, we were following the mantra of the Keynes economists, that of spending on infrastructure, giving people unemployed benefits and education to increase consumer demand, to increase our demand for products and services, to increase our spending so that the economy would grow. And Schumpeter was talking about innovation in the market, and design allied itself to innovation. What we need to ally ourselves towards now is value. What do we value? We value the environment. We value the climate. We value the world living beyond this century. So we need to think about economists like Kate Raworth and her reasoning around donut economics, or Mariana Mazzucato the value of everything, thinking about how companies take value rather than give value. We need to consider the boundaries of our planet, the resources and the role and the value of design in a global economy. So we need to think differently. We need to think beyond human-centered design. We need to apply all our tools of creativity, visualization, and materiality to help us live in both the digital and physical world in harmony. We need to design for policy. We need to design organizations. We need to design governance. We need design to change thinking and to engender new behaviors for the future of the planet. And we need to use design to challenge our paymasters, whether we're in academia or in industry. We now need to stand up and stand for our values and the values of our communities and our societies, and internationally, what we are all wanting is a long and healthy life, living in homes that are warm, and we have everything we need to survive without destroying the planet. We need to think differently. Thank you.
You know, I mean, your lecture was really overwhelming. After your having heard about your lecture, I think speech, I now think differently about you. Okay, yeah. You know, I knew you about something. You know, you are very charismatic leader of design research and also many different ways. But I did not realize that you did this much. Okay, it's something amazing. I think it's whole your biographical career is always with the new paradigm changes and those things. So far,
I didn't do it. I didn't do it all. I didn't do it all. I am just talking about the colleagues I brought together in imagination.
Okay,
they do all the work.
I know.
I just
know.
chat.
So you know, among our keynote speakers, of course, there are different disciplines. We intentionally invite different people to cover the various issues of design now. But I can see that there is one common overarching common denominator is that we need to change and beyond human-centered design. I think that's what exactly yesterday Don Norman is talking about, and also you are talking about this one, and those things is wonderful. You impressed me was your leadership with all different projects together, and that's amazing. And how can you orchestrate all those different things and together? That was really amazing to me. Okay. So I have many questions to ask you, but I want to just give up my question to all the audience from floor or online. Okay, anybody who wanna ask the question from stage? I mean the floor. Okay, we have the one audience who is a big fan of you. She's currently leading our design management, design entrepreneurship, Dr. Sylvia Liu. Okay.
Yeah. Richard, I'm Sylvia, from School of Design. Long time no see. Yeah, hi. Same as Professor Lee, I have so many questions in my mind. Let me start in first question. I don't know, maybe more question from the audience. As I heard about your work about Imagination Lab, because many friends and peers, they told me before the pandemic, they visit your lab. It's very impressive. My question is, yes, I know the title of the lab is Imagination, but how you define the boundary of the projects in your Imagination Lab?
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That was a very good question. I'm not sure we do. I think when we started, when there were only 7 of us, my view was was no boundary. You know, it was where the critical challenges were, what interested people. And also, I have to say, and this comes back to my original question, where the funding came from, because the UK has funding for design, but the UK government in general defines where that should be applied. So on the one hand, we were looking at, you know, anything. And the 7 of us, you can have a meeting every week. You can talk about these things. You can explore where you should work and what you should work on. You can exchange views about current issues and current research in a small group. When that group gets to 15, it's still small. But when we got to a group of 35 last year, in 2019, and we could not just say it's 1,000 flowers grow where you just throw seeds. We had to start to sort of categorize the areas in which we work. Hence we got the clusters, the sort of home and living, but we still didn't want to define the different disciplines that worked in that. We wanted to define the challenge in the areas we work. So it's co-created together with everybody and it builds up. But my view is, if people are facilitated and happy and enjoy their work and enjoy interaction and talk to each other, there will always be a new area, and we're always looking over the horizon. So it's all about intellectual fun. It's all about challenging the now and then helping people, guiding people to build their career. I think the important thing is for people to know what their skills and their discipline is, to move that and enable them to grow. So it's all, for me, it's all about building skills and enable people to grow, to have fun and to enjoy the work they do, both within the university, with the students and beyond the university. And also, I think, to engage in the zeitgeist of the times. You know, we've just done a project on COVID, as I'm assuming everybody has. You know, we're just finishing a book on design for COVID-19. We've, you know, so we obviously pick up on the zeitgeist of the times. That for me, I trained as a typographer. I was obsessed with the shape of letter forms. That my interest in that was never going to change the world. I was always more curious about other things, and so I moved beyond it. Curiosity is the driver of research.
Right, any other questions? Okay.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for your presentation. This is Jen Lee from Hong Kong PolyU. I felt like your presentation was kind of like an introspective journey into the positioning of design throughout, you know, through the history. And I do see how it's important for us to redefine and reframe ourselves as we try to reflect with this, you know, reflect the context that we're situated in. And I'm just wondering, I feel like it's also very important for us to be able to communicate as we think differently to other groups of people, like the sponsors and the people that we're working with and working for. How might we communicate better as we think differently? Thank you.
I think that is very important. I think how we communicate what we can offer, what we can do is critical. And I've had so many PhD students do their PhDs on the value of design and what design can do in this moment of rethinking. So my student Camilla Buchanan, who now works heads the policy lab in the UK government, did her PhD just on that. What was it she was doing in government that uses design that was different to that what all other policymakers were doing? So you do have to reflect on the design, what design brings to all of these areas. And if I was to say, what she found and what I believe is design brings some of these aspects of materiality, of visualization, enabling people to engage in the journey, visualize complex interdependencies. So this, the idea that designers can make, and design researchers can make material, the intangible, is still core to the way we think and do. And it's even more important now. So when policymakers are thinking about changing a policy, they need to think about the implications of that. So what designers can do can illustrate that through user journeys, through ontologies, through ontography, which, you know, so that we do need to illustrate the way in which we use our tools and techniques to enable people to understand the world and understand the opportunities, the challenges, the barriers to any decision, whether it's a decision in a company to produce a new product, whether it's a decision in government for a new regulation. We are able to do that through the way in which we think and operate and make manifest the intangible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I guess I was wondering, like more in detail how, because I feel like designers always have these ideas, and when implementing it, we actually need to work with other organizations, like government and, you know, whatsoever. So like, I'm wondering, because I feel like that's always a challenge to have the vision be implemented.
Yeah, so okay, so I have another aspect of one of the teams at Lancaster that I didn't introduce was the evaluation team. We are doing research on how to evaluate design research, how to evaluate design. I think for so long, we haven't had the tools and the techniques to, and what architects use they call post-occupancy evaluation. And actually that's never done very well. We do need, not only when we're designing, to think about the design process, and but also alongside that, how we evaluate that process, how we evaluate post hoc the impact of the design, so that we have the evidence to illustrate the role of design in the system, which I think for too long we've struggled to have. So we need not only to design the design process, but we need to design the design evaluation process alongside.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I just have a quick follow-up to the last two questions. And it was partially answered already, but I'm just curious, like when you're pursuing these larger ideas, how thoroughly do you situate yourself within the local community? Like do you start, is that only, I saw with the caravan idea, that was through the testing phase, but does the community non-university related, do they have access to the labs? Do you start by getting ideas through engagement with localized concerns, then try to use that as a case for something larger? How does that work? Thank you.
I think that depends on the researcher themselves, and it will change according to the way in which the research question starts. But let me take an example that I'm doing now. Now that we're bigger, I spend a lot of my time with the Design for Policy group. So we're doing work on policy making, and we are working with the local city government to look at how they can approach the design of policy for a net zero, zero carbon city. And from the beginning, we are co-creating the research process, the engagement with the community, the engagement with policymakers, with the city council, and with the industry. So we will be doing that research together to design the process, to undertake the process, and to produce the solutions. So it is a joint co-creation. Now that's me, and that's the particular way in which we need to think about designing policy. So I think it just depends on the research question where you go in. Yeah. That's it. I think it's the research question. As in all research, define your question and work out what approach you want to take in which to get to the answer better.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now then I will move to online questions. Okay, let me read through. Okay. One of the quotes within your slides says something along the lines of innovation is nothing without implementation. And I think especially many young designers currently in art school are very idealistic with plenty of the enthusiasm for the change. What would be your words for advice to those young designers, young frontline designers in agencies or freelance wanting to change and challenge corporate system that more than not is reluctant to adopt idea of change?
Okay, so that is a really good question. I have just had the experience of mentoring a young urban designer stroke architect working with a client. Now the client asked me to mentor her, so this might be a little easier, but I was mentoring her on how to work. This comes back to my role in design management. I was mentoring her on how to work with a client. So the client had ambitions for an environmental, a socially, sorry about that. The client had a desire to build a place that was environmentally sound, socially sound, economically sound. They had all the values that the designer believed they were working with. But as you go along, the designer is obviously often struggling with idealistic, maybe novel ideas that the client just is not sure about and hasn't got proof. And then this is where, and if you remember in the presentation, there was a slide that had a scales, values, stroke of values. It was that designer that drew that for me, because we were always struggling with the client in terms of their value, i.e. what money am I going to get out of this project in the end, versus their values in terms of economic, social, etc., sustainability. What we did as a designer, what I encouraged her to do was develop something called a values matrix to feed back to the client what their values were, not just the bottom line value, but what were their values, to extract from them precisely what their value was, and then translate how the designer was going to translate that value into an outcome in the end product. So how she was going to get there. And we need, again, we need these tools and mechanisms to illustrate, to talk to clients about. So we come back to companies. They might say they want to be socially responsible, they might say they want to be economically responsible, but they will have a bottom line. So the designers now have to build tools and techniques to illustrate how they are answering some of those things, and there is value coming out of the environmental design, the social issues, as well as the bottom line value. And this is where you start to use the tools of social value, natural capital, etc. And there are ways of doing that, but that is where designers have to start to look at what's happening in industry. There's a tool in the United States called GRESB, which is a tool that are used by investors to analyze how companies are being sustainable in all sorts of factors. So I think in training to be a designer, I'm afraid we also need to train ourselves and build techniques to engage in a relationship with the corporate system.
Okay, I think the time is now off, right? So there are many questions still line up the online also. When I see our audience, their eyes are still telling me they have more questions. But I have to close up this one, this session, keynote speech. As I felt, I think that you all, I think, had an exciting time here in Hong Kong now evening, just before the dinner. But still, people are really enjoying your talk. And thank you again that the Rachel Coopers, the talking us think differently. Okay, I think that we need to always use that whenever people taking action, whether I'm thinking differently or not. Okay, I think that's a really good one takeaway today. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.